The Synchro Mystic presents Synchro Mystique. As of this writing, the United States is in another presidential election year. Will the process, or outcome, be as fraught with controversy as the last time around? Who can say? I'm not joining that fracas. And rather than guessing about the future, I prefer studying the past. So in this video, I'll survey some of the milestones in the checkered history of alleged or suspected ballot chicanery. We're going to ignore several factors. One is the persistence of mudslinging and name-calling. There are just too many instances of that to be meaningfully cataloged. Another is the recent creation, say within the last 100 years or so, of sophisticated advertising techniques. Originally called propaganda, the story of how this morphed into the discipline of public relations, or PR, is too complex and nuanced for me to do it justice here. In a way, this is really unfortunate because no full accounting of election manipulation could be complete without it. Nevertheless, I'll have to leave that for another time. But the importance of PR seems acknowledged by the establishment itself. After all, it was not for nothing that 2008's award for Marketer of the Year went to none other than Barack Hussein Obama, or to be specific, to his campaign advertisers. Finally, and perhaps relatedly, we're not going to try to ascertain what impact, if any, might be felt from the murky world of espionage. That is, we'll have to leave for a future presentation the question of what various intelligence services, whether foreign or domestic, may or may not be doing during presidential election years. Number 1. Gerrymandering. We could probably pick up our story in a number of places, but we'll start with the 18th to 19th century American statesman Elbridge Gerry. He served first as a congressman and later governor of Massachusetts. He was also vice president under 4th U.S. President James Madison. However, his enduring contribution to posterity stems from the word gerrymandering, which refers to the unsavory practice of changing or setting the boundaries of a political district to favor one's own party. It seems Gerry's base was likened to a mythical monster due to its highly unusual shape, and the portmanteau formed from his surname and the word salamander entered the English language. Number 2. Votes schmotes. John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. On the national scene, the first major trouble came in 1824. The presidential contest pitted the eventual declared victor, John Adams' oldest son, John Quincy Adams, against several competitors. The most prominent was Major General Andrew Jackson, hero of the War of 1812. One of the most conspicuous features of the election was that Adams lost the vote. To be more precise about that, Adams lost both the popular and the electoral votes. However, Jackson did not receive enough votes to win in the Electoral College, so under the 12th Amendment, it fell to the House of Representatives to determine the outcome. Adams won by a single vote after Henry Clay was eliminated through negotiation, and his supporters in the House awarded their votes to Adams. Jackson and his supporters were livid at the results. Many cried foul, calling the conclusion the result of a corrupt bargain. 4 years later, John Quincy Adams was, however, soundly defeated by Jackson. Number 3. Carpetbaggers and other matters. The current political landscape contains sharp divides, but it has been argued that if we reach back to the Depression or the Civil War, we can find periods of U.S. history where the country has been even more divided. For instance, during the post-bellum era, ratification of the anti-slavery 13th Amendment was made possible in part by the North's reconstruction of the South's political institutions to align better with its values. Or again, the 14th Amendment, which has been the focus of speculative chatter over the last 4 years, originally prohibited former civil and military office holders who supported the Confederacy from again holding any state or federal office. Keep this amendment in mind because we'll get back to it a bit later. In plain English, the Reconstruction Acts established military rule over southern states until new, Union-friendly governments could be formed. They also limited some former Confederate officials and military officers' rights to vote and to run for public office. True, some of its practical effects were mitigated by the General Amnesty Act of 1872, but this amnesty did nothing to stem the tidal wave of Northerners who flooded the southern states. These so-called carpetbaggers aimed to exploit the newly enfranchised ex-slaves, and they took full advantage of the years when many Southerners saw their political rights curtailed. Agree with the rationale or not, Reconstruction certainly involved election engineering, so it is no surprise that several major disputes came during this tumultuous period. Number 4. Vote the right way. U.S. Grant versus Horatio Seymour. An important illustration of this, not much talked about, was in 1868. This pitted the much ballyhooed Republican and ex-Union General Ulysses S. Grant against former New York Governor and Democrat Horatio Seymour. First, however, it's important to understand what the word Democrat implies here. To get a quick fix on this, consider the election of 1860, in the lead-up to the Civil War. Incidentally, this is the time period that cemented the now ubiquitous two-party Democratic-Republican rivalry. But in fact, the Democratic Party had fractured along now familiar north-south lines. The so-called Southern Democrats backed John C. Breckinridge, while their northern counterparts endorsed Stephen A. Douglas, of Lincoln-Douglas debate fame. But in the wake of the Civil War, of course, the pro-slavery Democrat position was criminalized. During the election of 1864, not only were Southern slavery extension Democrats on the outs, but also many peace Democrats were tarred as near treasonable copperheads. With the crucial slavery issue decided militarily, the only remaining Democrats were so similar to the Republicans that Collier's Encyclopedia declared that during Reconstruction, quote, competition between the parties revolved largely around which party's office seekers would be in power, and which set of politicos would reap the spoils of office. This theme, that the two parties didn't differ all that much, crops up repeatedly. Let's bring it back to the 1868 election. The Democratic Seymour was known as a moderate in the mold of Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Grant represented the radical Republicans who pressed for faster, greater, and more widespread socio-political changes. Thus, the range of permissible options was limited to the choosing between two versions of Reconstruction. Those states that still refused to get on board this bandwagon, such as Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, were excluded from the 1868 presidential election. Number 5. The Great Fraud of 1876. Following U.S. Grant's 2 scandal-plagued terms, the Republican Party nominated Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. Facing him was the Democratic Governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden. As was the case with John Quincy Adams' election in 1824, Rutherford Hayes lost the popular vote, but this time both sides alleged fraud. The preceding president, U.S. Grant, went so far as to deploy U.S. troops to safeguard the Capitol. Now, why does that sound familiar? In Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, Southern Republican voters were allegedly subjected to intimidation and threats, just as diehard Southern Democrats had been following what they called the war between the states. Meanwhile, in Oregon, a dispute arose with a presidential elector. Ultimately, the heated situation required the creation of a special electoral commission. The whole affair wasn't resolved until the warring parties agreed to the Compromise of 1877, according to which Hayes's election was allowed to stand. But in return, federal troops were finally withdrawn from the South. This effectively ended Reconstruction and originated the so-called Solid South, a coalition which didn't crumble until the promulgation of polarizing civil rights legislation during the 1960s. Number 6. Another round of trouble. Garfield versus Hancock. The precarious peace achieved in 1877 was short-lived. The next election cycle was scarcely less problematic. The contest matched two former Union generals, James Garfield and Winfield Scott Hancock. Although the Republican did win the popular decision, the margin was razor-thin. When all the ballots were counted, fewer than 2,000 votes separated Garfield and Hancock, which, according to Wikipedia and other sources, makes it the closest popular vote of any American presidential election before or since. For his part, Hancock was convinced that the Republicans had won New York by fraud, but for pragmatic reasons, the Democrats did not pursue the matter. Subsequently, Garfield became the second U.S. president to be murdered while in office. In seeming attestation to French poet Arthur Rimbaud's declaration celebration of humanity's entry into the Time of the Assassins. As a side note, Garfield was a Freemason and mathematician who is credited with a unique proof of the well-known Pythagorean theorem. As it turns out, Hancock was also a Freemason. For more on these angles, no pun intended, see our past videos, Pythagoras, and presidents who were in secret societies. Number 7. The robber barons candidate, McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan. Less than a decade after its inception, the Republican Party dominated the federal executive, from the election of Abraham Lincoln, arguably through the administration of Herbert Hoover. The first exception had arguably been Andrew Johnson, who only inherited the high office because of the Great Emancipator's assassination. Influential 20th century Democrats like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt hadn't come onto the scene yet. During this time, the main interruption to partisan republicanism had been Grover Cleveland, who, as a bit of trivia, was the only person, as of this recording, to serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president. But Cleveland had disappointed rank-and-file workers and alienated labor unions by siding with industrialist George Pullman during the infamous Pullman strike in 1894. Cleveland's use of federal troops to suppress striking workers resulted in the death of around 30 of them, and this was something many Democrats would not easily forget, even after Cleveland's institution of the Labor Day holiday. Added to this was the turmoil of the economic panic of 1893. The upshot of the whole thing was the ushering in of an era of progressivism. In this regard, one of the most pivotal Democrats of the time was the fiery orator and populist William Jennings Bryan. Bryan's prowess is legendary. His Cross of Gold speech has been called the single most influential and electrifying campaign speech in American political history. In it, he denounced the gold standard and ended with the unforgettable line, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." For additional context, see William Bill Still's The Money Masters. Faced with this groundswell of support for the plight of the common man, a group of business magnates including Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan joined forces to block Bryan's ascension and promote a Republican candidacy. According to the History Channel, in its 2012 series The Men Who Built America, these businessmen, some lifelong enemies, came together with a plan to buy the White House by donating the modern equivalent of $30 million to Ohio Governor William McKinley. The same production also disclosed that Bryan's supporters and would-be electorate frequently faced strong-arm tactics at the ballot box. This included warnings issued by factory owners that anyone who voted Democrat would be fired. Predictably, following his victory, McKinley repealed many business regulations and allowed his patrons to expand their business ventures without consequence or impediment. Number 8. Vote early, vote often. Students of U.S. history are probably well familiar with New York City's Tammany Hall political machine. Once upon a time, it was run by a succession of local political bosses, including, infamously, William M. Tweed. But New York was far from the only major city to have been controlled in this way. In fact, Tweed is only one, albeit probably the best known, of the local political bosses. Many, even most of whom, regularly fixed elections by techniques such as ballot stuffing and other underhanded measures. Well into the middle of the 20th century, longtime Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley had a reputation for doing precisely this sort of thing. Daley is often called the last of the bosses, and there were numerous connections, many of them shady, between these ruthless city administrators and other power blocks, such as organized labor and organized crime. So, as we're ruminating on these interlaced factors and their possible election-skewing effects, we cannot neglect to mention the 1960 race between John F. Kennedy and Richard M. Nixon. The former won, of course, but JFK's narrow margin of victory periodically gave rise to the charge that it was partly owed to mob influence. And although it is difficult to determine whether this is genuine history or propaganda, it certainly shows that disputed presidential elections are not 21st century novelties. Not that they are exactly relics of a bygone era either. And while we're on the subject, it's not like Nixon has gone down in history as a beloved leader. His 1972 CRP, or Campaign for the Re-election of the President, was so fraught with mischief and depended so heavily on the use of dirty tricks that it was derisively re-lettered to form the acronym CREEP. Number 9. Hanging Chads. Bush versus Gore. Of more recent vintage was the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Numerous commentators, both contemporaneously and retrospectively, accused the Republicans of foul play, not least because that contest came down to a dispute decided by the U.S. Supreme Court over results in Florida, of all places. And just who happened to have been then governor of that crucial state? The 43rd president's brother, John Ellis Jeb Bush. Of course. Media outlets drew attention back to other close-call elections, such as the one in 1876, which we discussed already. Admittedly, however, Albert Arnold Gore Jr., being tight with both Bill and Hillary Clinton, as well as with the family of communist-leaning capitalists, figure that one out, Armand Hammer, is probably not the poster boy for political innocence. Number 10. Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. By way of preface, an interesting sidelight appeared in a 1969 American Heritage article. Subtitled The Rise and Fall of the Age of the Bosses, the author stated that by the time of his writing, most of the bosses had disappeared. But he then made the following trenchant remark. A hypothetical young man who had the energy, persistence, and skill in 1899 to become a successful political boss would, in subsequent years, go to college and end up in an executive suite. If this is so, then bossism merely changed forms, and the political heavies simply moved from the mean streets of Anywhere USA to the inner sanctum of Acme Incorporated. Weaving in our theme of little difference between the two major parties, Collier's Encyclopedia admits, with occasional exceptions, both parties by the 1870s came to represent the dominant corporate interests of unprecedented, often freebooting capitalist expansion, with their concern for minimal government regulation. With these tidbits in mind, consider a three-point explanation once provided by linguistics professor and social critic Noam Chomsky to summarize the significance of the 2010 Supreme Court decision known as Citizens United. Point number 1. Since 1886, the Supreme Court has upheld a view, known as corporate personhood, that various company structures enjoy at least some of the privileges and rights of natural persons, like you and me. The claimed justification for this was the 14th Amendment, which I earlier told you to keep in the back of your mind. Think about this for just 1 second. The question of the personhood and rights of slaves was so pressing, a war was supposedly fought to settle it. And regardless of your viewpoint, it can't have escaped your notice that so-called culture wars are raging presently over questions such as, are the unborn persons? And should immigrants enjoy the same rights as natural-born or naturalized citizens? These issues are raised or shouted about in public forums all over the country. But when, pray tell, have you ever in your life heard one peep about corporate personhood? This notion has stood without any meaningful challenge approaching 150 years. That should tell you something about power dynamics in America. For more discussion, see our past videos. Point number 2. Since 1976, the Supreme Court further declared that campaign spending is a form of protected free speech. And when money is equated with speech, the money masters corner the market on that particular freedom, it seems. Finally, point number 3, quoting from Wikipedia, this culminated in the 2010 Citizens United versus FEC decision that unleashed virtually unlimited secret corporate money into federal elections. The Supreme Court ruled that it couldn't limit corporate election spending without violating the First Amendment. Because again, corporations are persons, and spending is free speech. Nothing to see here. The overriding motivation is the maxim, whoever spends the most wins. There's an important but tricky philosophical proviso about the danger of confusing causation and correlation. But if your opponent can outspend you enough, then at the very least you're fighting an uphill battle. They might even take you to court if they lose. And that's not intended as a partisan remark, by the way. If your opponent's backers have no practical limitations, because their pockets have Harry Potter-esque undetectable extension charms, or they're able to secure zero-interest loans from the Federal Reserve, then you're in for it. Number 11. The Republic dies bold. There were plenty of concerns over vote fraud throughout the 2000s. Last but not least, there's the technical side of things. One of the highlights, or lowlights, was a paper released by Argonne National Laboratory during the run-up to the 2012 election. As one Computer World article put it, researchers at the Argonne National Laboratory this week showed how an electronic voting machine model that's expected to be widely used to tally votes in the 2012 elections can be easily hacked using inexpensive, widely available electronic components. Roger Johnston, head of the Vulnerability Assessment Team at the U.S. Department of Energy's Science and Engineering Research Lab, said the hack, which requires about $25 and very little technical expertise, would let cybercriminals flip votes gathered on Diebold AccuVote TS machines and change election results without raising any suspicions. All that to say, the kerfuffle surrounding recent and looming elections is sadly nothing new.